Hello, this is Scott Ferguson, Principal Solution Architect with our global GRC and security practice. And for the next few minutes, I want to talk to you a little bit about our risk management application. So as we start the risk conversation, the first thing we want to do is provide a portal, right? Because in many organizations, like yourself, there are various risk owners throughout the organization, and they need one place where they can go to see what are all of my risks. What are all of my mitigating or compensating controls? What are the risk assessments that I need to complete? And you don't want to send them to different places to accomplish that. So we start with our portal. And as a risk manager, right, so Grace Abbott, our risk manager here, can sign into the portal. And the first thing that they're going to see here, underneath the banners across the top, is their version of the risk register or the My Controls, right? They can also see assessments that they need to take. So we're going to pick up a couple of these pieces, and then we'll switch roles into from an end user to an actual risk manager or someone within the risk team that's going to manage that risk and review that risk and look at the scoring of that risk. So the first thing we see here is Grace has the ability to complete a risk assessment, right? So in this case, Grace has been assigned a risk assessment, right? She's someone out in the organization, and she's going to start this process, and she's presented with a form, right, with a questionnaire. And they're the typical types of questions that you would expect when assessing, especially if you're looking at this from a qualitative perspective, questions about reputational impact. And right, she's asked to answer these questions, and she goes through, and she's also asked about what's the expected frequency of this risk event, which is a more of a quantitative type of question because we support both methods, right? And this is one that's going to drive to things like your annual rate of occurrence. So how frequent is a risk event likely, right? So in this case, maybe it's more than once a year. So we're looking at assessing this risk from an inherent perspective. As she continues down the path, she also is asked to assess this risk from a residual perspective, right? After you implement a series of mitigating or compensating controls, ask to answer the same questions. What's the expected frequency, right? We're going to put in controls to keep this from occurring, so that expected frequency is going to be a longer period of time. We answer these questions and we submit. So this is a very easy and simple way for those people within the organization that need to complete these risk assessments to do that through the portal. The other thing that Grace sees here as part of this is she also has visibility into that set of mitigating and compensating controls that are tied to those specific risks. Now, the other thing that I want to point out here while we're on that portal and we're talking about Grace's experience here is she also has the ability to see her risks. And now that I've drilled into this specific risk, Grace can see the details of this. From the state that it's in to the category, it's an operational risk, which assessment had to be completed, as well as the scoring that goes with this from an inherent and a residual perspective. In either the qualitative or the quantitative methodology, she has visibility into all of that information. She also, at the bottom of this form, has visibility into, well, what are those mitigating controls? What are the compensating controls? What are the assessments that had to be completed? Are there other related policy exceptions? And we talked about this in the policy and compliance presentation that we've done, but you've got policy exceptions that just because that exception was approved doesn't mean that the risk doesn't still exist. And this is where that would manifest itself. Now, we see all of this type of information from the service portal. But now let's flip over and see this from someone that may be working risks for the entire organization, right? Not just specific ones. So the first thing that we're going to see here is we've got our risk overview dashboard. And again, you've got a set of inherent risk reports and you've got a set of residual risk reports. And you would expect to see that you get better over time. So when we load this particular dashboard, the first thing that you'll see across the top of the dashboard is a very quick color-coded set of what are the risks that I have in my organization. But we can also break that down in a couple of different ways. If you adhere to a more qualitative approach to risk assessments, you're going to see this inherent risk heat map that takes your impact and your likelihood and plots them over a heat map, a configurable heat map that has the red, yellow, and green tiers. But we also give the ability to look at risks from a more quantitative perspective. I can see things like, well, what was the single loss expectancy over the annual rate of occurrence that gives me that annualized loss expectancy, and I can plot out those risks to my organization from a more quantitative perspective. And all of this information is available to me on my dashboard. I have those same sets of reports from a residual perspective, and I can see here the risks mapped out on my heat map and the bubble charts from a residual perspective as well. One of the things that I want to point out, though, is that these are all actionable. We've got one-click kind of reporting. So in this case, if I wanted to look at our financial application, so in this case, I look at my financial accounting app, I filter that down, my entire dashboard updates to reflect just that specific asset that I'm looking at. So in this case, because I filtered this by my financial application, my financial accounting application, it shows me that I only have 3 risks, and it's actually a little scary because from a financial accounting perspective, they're all pretty high. So we may want to drill into this a little bit more. So if we drill into that very high risk that we have to the organization, it takes us into our dynamic risk register. And the ServiceNow risk register is one of those. It's not just a static spreadsheet, right? It's just not a static list that you have a list of all of those risks to the organization and you just have to kind of sort through it manually and understand what your exposure is. But the ServiceNow risk register is very dynamic. And you can see here that I got to a filtered risk register based upon something that I clicked on with a dashboard. Now, I absolutely could drop off other pieces of this and get into an entire risk register of all 489 risks that I have within the environment. Now, just to demonstrate kind of some of that flexibility, I see things like my inherent and my residual score. You can do things like, well, let's filter out things that have a very low residual score, or maybe even, only show things that are operational in nature. I can just show my operational risks. Maybe I want to right-click and filter out those things that are in a draft state. You can see that the number of risks, this dynamic risk register starts to narrow in on just those things that I care about. Now, from here, right, maybe we continue to eliminate some of the smaller noise here, and we're going to get down to that set of things that we really care about. And there we also see that same one that we were looking at before. So if we look at the loss of availability for our financial accounting app, let's look at that very high risk one in a little bit more detail. On that particular risk, the first thing that I'll point out, just like we saw in previous demonstrations around policy and compliance, is there's an entire life cycle. We have life cycles to risk, we have life cycles to incident or issues, we have life cycles to all of the other pieces that make up the GRC suite, and risk here is no different. A risk gets first identified and it comes in a draft state, and then you assess it. And we saw an example of what that assessment looked like when we were on the portal. Grace had to go through and answer a series of questions. Now, from a risk manager perspective, if I wanted to see the answers to Grace's questions, they're right here at the bottom of this form. So I still have the ability to go back in and look at the details of what may have been responded or how that was responded to. Then we get to the point where we have to decide, how are we going to respond to this risk? What is our response? So if we look here in the middle section of this particular risk, the risk response is where we're going to determine, do we want to mitigate this risk? Do we want to avoid this risk? Do we want to transfer this risk? Or do we want to accept this risk? And there's really 4 different risk response that are a part of the ServiceNow platform. Based upon the fact that this one was listed to mitigate, right? Now we could go down the accept path, and the workflow is going to take us through a series of approvals, and someone needs to evaluate that, and is this the right thing to accept? And right, we're going to have that acceptance that comes with that. The one that we're looking at here is going down the mitigate path. So the first thing that you're going to do when you mitigate a risk is someone has to develop that risk mitigation plan. So the workflow that's behind driving that through the risk platform automatically created this risk response task. And in this case, it's the mitigation task. And you can see here where Grace was the owner of this particular task. It came in a draft state. She has to put together this plan, and the plan is to implement some mitigating controls. And at this point, she's going to go ahead and it has to be reviewed, and we're probably waiting on someone to, and she lists those additional mitigating controls here, and then someone has to review that and approve it and move it forward within the process. If we go back to the risk itself, right, it's in this review state. And in that review state is where we're going to see someone within the organization that has to approve the fact that these are the right mitigating or compensating controls. So you can see in this case, there are 9 controls that have been associated to this risk as compensating controls. Now here's where it gets interesting. When you start to put policy and compliance together with risk into a single consolidated platform, you're going to see a couple of things. Notice here, and again, this is covered in the policy and compliance application, but I have a set of these controls. Some of them are compliant and some of them are non-compliant. Well, one could argue that if a mitigating control that was put in place to make sure that this risk was not exploited is a non-effective control, that I'm probably not actually achieving my residual risk score. So this is how that's going to manifest itself. When we look at the scoring of a risk, and you've seen various pieces of this as we've walked through the risk application thus far, but we started with this inherent risk score. The impact was very high. The likelihood was extremely likely. We went through an assessment and we went through, a risk mitigation plan, and we put in some mitigating controls. And the idea there, or the outcome of that activity, was that over here on the right, you see that the residual impact was low, the residual likelihood was extremely unlikely, and that drove us to a residual risk score of very low. And that's fabulous. But what we realize is that we actually have ineffective mitigating controls. So what ServiceNow is doing for you here, right, and this risk scoring is what we're going to use to help automatically assign, right, for easy prioritization of who needs to do what. But it's also allowing us, through this calculation, we're able to spot new high risks or emerging threats in real time. That's going to help you control your actual risk exposure. You see that right here with this calculated risk score. ServiceNow is actually calculating a risk score for you based upon really 2 things. One, the first one is the effectiveness of your controls. And we've already seen that the controls that were associated to this risk are halfway, right? Only half of them are actually effective. If I select the monitoring section here in the middle of this risk, you actually see that, right? There was 9 controls, 5 of them were non-compliant, so I've got a control failure factor of 44. Half of my risk indicators are failing, and because of that, I'm calculating a risk score. We're able to spot those high risks, those emerging threats to your organization in real time, and actually help control risk exposure to the organization, and this is what shows up on that dashboard. So if we go back to our risk dashboard, what we're going to see is those things that show up on this dashboard that are now very high risk, right? This information is going to be updated automatically based upon my control effectiveness, based upon my risk assessments, based upon risk indicators, and now I can manage my business through the risk indicators or through the risk dashboards in the ServiceNow platform. So this wraps up our conversation around risk management. And if you'd like some additional information, don't hesitate to check out the ServiceNow website for that additional information. And that wraps up our conversation on risk management.